When I first meet someone, it is only a few minutes before that familiar question comes. Where are you from? You aren't from here, are you? You must be from the South. I have gotten that question more times than I can count. When I speak other languages, this accent disappears. Can you believe that? I remember I have an Albanian friend, and he told me one time, he's an English professor, and he said, you don't have an accent when you speak French, you don't have one when you speak Albanian. So, you know what I do? When I meet a student that you have taught ESL, English, in ESL classes, I know I say, who is your teacher? I know your teacher. Oh, can you imagine a lot of Albanian young people walking around today speaking English with an accent? Sometimes I was asked that question, where are you from? Not because of the accent, but because I was a stranger. It took a little longer than just a casual conversation, if I was speaking their language, to know that Albania or Macedonia wasn't my home. Not my home of origin, anyway. What's it like to be recognized as a stranger? Have you ever been in a situation where you feel and have felt utterly alone? You're like a child again. You don't understand the culture, you don't know the way of doing things, you don't know the rules, you can't figure out anything. It doesn't feel good, does it? I have experienced that feeling more than once. We spent 12 years in Burkina Faso, West Africa, and we're finally figuring out the culture. It took a lot of listening and trying to understand the way things were done. We spoke the language, we taught literacy classes and theology courses, and we lived in a village, a small village of CUCC, about an hour out of the capital, which was named Ouagadougou, by the way. It was a drought-stricken area. It was in the southern part of the Sahara Desert, where there were constant problems with infrastructure. Not enough water, lack of reliable electricity, horrific roads. Then there were the constant illnesses that were more or less curable in the U.S. These diseases took the lives of people we had come to love like family. Because of our experiences in Burkina, we thought we'd be prepared for our move to Albania, even though it meant learning another entirely different language. However, communism had just fallen a few years before we arrived in Tirana, Albania, and everything was in chaos. The airport runway was not really paved, not necessarily. Electricity was less reliable than it had been in Burkina Faso. The lack of water was a constant problem. We eventually learned to get up early so that we could fill the water tank that was on top of our house to have drinking water and water for the necessities of daily living. Since Albania had been closed off from the rest of the world for 50 years due to the dictates of their former leader, Enver Hoxha, Albanians lived a very isolated life. Things began to change. For example, in those years of isolation, there were very few cars. All of a sudden, cars were brought into the country in mass, illegally at first. So anyone could buy a car or a truck, and they could drive it without a license because there were no licenses, and whatever age you happen to be. That meant no road rules, few traffic lights. So crossing the street was literally taking your life in your own hands. There were no maps of the city. This was before cell phones and GPS, you know. So it was a Friday afternoon when we were dropped off at the house that we had been rented for us. And I asked the driver to draw us a crude map on a little piece of paper I found where we were located in relation to the main part of the city, especially the market. So we could at least buy food and begin to adjust to our surroundings before the organization that we worked for, the European Baptist Federation, opened its offices on Monday morning. Everything was a mystery. The currency was Albanian lek, but that took quite a bit of time to figure out too, because there was old lek and new lek, and you never knew which one you were paying. On top of all that, we had to exchange money from dollars to lek on the street. There was only one bank, it was Italian, and the only one in the country when we arrived, and everybody else had to change their money on the street. So you can see that we had a lot of things to learn and to figure out on our own without any Albanian language skills yet. Folks definitely knew we were not from there or from any surrounding country, for a matter of fact. For some reason, that was the way these two travelers saw Jesus, as a total stranger. The scripture says their eyes were kept from recognizing him. They asked him, "Are you the only person visiting in Jerusalem who is unaware of the things that have happened in these last few days?" Even though Jesus spoke the language, they all saw him as a stranger. Over the past months, my mind has gone to the times we were the foreigners. Even though we were far from what we knew as our home of origin, our journey was not as difficult as the journey many families fleeing across a border or entering the U.S. as immigrants, illegally or not, have to make. Preparations were made for us in most cases, making our entry into this new chosen home. You notice I said chosen home. Our lives were not in danger. We were not fleeing from a threat of death or prison or war or a dictator. We were not leaving our country of origin because we had to. And even with all the chaos and upheaval of moving to a new place and with all the adjustments required, we knew that if we had to, we could go back home. Many people seeking a safe place to live in security and with a sense of belonging don't have that luxury. We are told in Luke's account of this journey that as they walked that road to Emmaus, they talked and they discussed the events that had happened during the previous week. They recounted details about Jesus of Nazareth. They talked about his trial, his death, and how they had hoped he would be the Redeemer of Israel. We are told, we are also can imagine all the things, we can't imagine all the things that they talked about that day because it was a 7-mile journey. But we find Jesus interpreting scriptures for them and events that the two travelers had talked about. Still, no recognition of who he was. Telling your story, getting to know one another, explaining your hearts, decoding your history, translating who you are to others is a vital part of being alive. When you share your story, you're saying, I mattered. Our sharing of stories in community, especially here, tears down walls. It unites cultures. It deepens bonds, and it makes love possible. It helps us, too, to realize that we are more alike than we are different. One of our greatest challenges is to pay attention, to listen and learn from those who are most affected by the circumstances of life that we cannot understand because of where we stand. In this way, we learn what God is up to in the world and what he's asking of us. We know how to do this because Jesus showed us over and over again. It was during our language study in Tirana when one of the language tutors, Kayla, invited us to her home to meet her family. Her father had been an English professor at the University of Tirana, and her mother was a biochemist. That is, before the dictatorship of Enver Hoxha relegated anyone who could speak English to something resembling house arrest for fear they would be a danger to his regime. And this applied to Kayla's mother as well. Her work as a chemist was taken from her, and she was made to clean toilets for the government. The day of our visit, we received a warm welcome into their home, where we sat and shared cups of tea and coffee and Albanian sweets as they told us stories of their life. At one point, Mr. Vesely told us about finding a few pages of an English language Bible in the dumpster one day. He made sure that no one saw him take it out of the trash. He hid it under his coat and walked home very slowly so that he would not draw attention to himself. When evening came, he pulled out the pages and swore his family to secrecy because if he'd been found out, he could have gone to prison. That was not the first time he read those pages. He read them over and over again, translating into Albanian everything he read. After months of reading, the whole family decided together that they believed what he read. One of the passages, he pulled the page out, and it was the story we read this morning. It included the death and the resurrection of Jesus. Their faith became the most important part of their family life. It was put into practice when they took a Jewish family into their home and hid them in their basement during the Nazi occupation. That is serious hospitality, wouldn't you say? It was the same gift of hospitality they offered us, which we experienced during that visit. It formed a bond of friendship that has lasted the whole time we were in Albania and past. We were no longer strangers. They made us feel at home. The travelers in our story included Jesus in the conversation, even though they saw him as a stranger. So when they get closer to their village, they urged him strongly to go home with them, to stay with them. They had been witnesses during Jesus' ministry. They'd been invited in because Jesus was invited into homes wherever he went about doing good. But notice, this time they are the ones inviting Jesus in, even though they had not yet recognized him. He was still a stranger. Jesus must have beamed inside when they said, "Come, stay with us." Maybe with spiritual practice of hospitality, they were finally getting it. Our American concept of hospitality is so different from what the first disciples knew and practiced. We want to create a nice space where visitors can come and visit with us. We want to have a good time, of course, and we want our guests to feel comfortable and welcomed and then go home. In Jesus' day, it was completely different. Traveling in places like Galilee was probably one of the most vulnerable experiences a human could ever have. There were no convenient rest stops or establishments for lodging. Away from home and community, a traveler was an easy target for violence. You had to make it to the next town before sundown and then go to an individual home and request hospitality. The homeowner, however, was obliged to offer it. No matter who you were or where you came from, you would be received into the house. You would be given fresh clothing to wear and water to wash your dusty feet. Only after you had eaten and rested was it appropriate for them to ask you your name or where you came from or what your business would be in town. In some places, including places in Eastern Europe like Albania and Macedonia, many people still practice this form of hospitality. You are offered the best food in the house as their guest, the most honored place to sleep, often at the expense of family members. This kind of hospitality can happen even in the middle of a refugee camp, where a tent is the only home they have to offer. True hospitality is welcoming someone who is a stranger to you and allowing yourself to be changed in the process. So it was with these two travelers on that road to Emmaus. Later, followers of Jesus found that it was a powerful and potent way to practice resurrection. It prepared their hearts and their lives for moments of recognition that changed everything. A few Sundays ago, I mentioned my friend Habibi Hassani, who had a dream. She envisioned a kindergarten that would help Albanian students go to public school. At that time, there was a test in order to enter first grade, yet there were no kindergartens, no one to prepare them, and none of them were free. That is for Albanian children. Her idea was to give them a chance at a better life by offering nutritious meals, teaching them their numbers and their letters, how to hold a pencil, how to write, how to draw. They would be loved and nourished in more ways than just the food they ate. In the 8 years the kindergarten was open, 350 families saw their children learn and thrive, most of them going on to complete at least an 8th grade education, almost unheard of. Habibia did the interviews with the parents and the children in order to choose the pupils that would be able to learn in a classroom situation and would most likely have the support of their parents to do it. So one morning that summer, just before school was starting in the fall, Habibia went to the home of a Roma family to interview Rosmir about her son attending the school. She entered the small one-room, dirt-floor dwelling, and Rosmir greeted her with a smile. Then she offered Habibia the best of 2 stools she had to sit on. Habibia told me that she knew immediately, after talking with Rosmir extensively, that her son would do well in our kindergarten. They talked a bit more about what he would be learning at school, and then Rosmir asked Habibia if she would like to have a cup of tea. Habibia told me later that it crossed her mind that if she said yes to that, it would mean that her son would go to the neighborhood kiosk and would purchase the tea with the last bit of money Rosmir had. But something told Habibia to say yes anyway, and so she did. For sure, Rosmir sent her son to the kiosk with the last bit of money, and then Rosmir went behind the curtain and prepared the water for tea. When it was ready, she graciously served the tea, but Habibia noticed there were tears in her eyes. And Habibia asked her if she had said something to upset her, and Rosmir quickly replied, "No, these are tears of joy." You see, Habibia was the first person who wasn't Roma who had ever accepted her tea. She told Habibia she was sure they must have thought her house wasn't clean enough. They both shed tears then. Habibia told me that she was never so glad that she had listened to that voice within her because it changed everything. The cup, this cup, poured out for the poorest of the poor, whose rooms have a dirt floor. This cup offered in hospitality and received with equality. This cup of friendship poured out from above and enjoyed in love. Take this cup in remembrance of divine love. Take this cup in hope of genuine mutuality. Take this cup offered from hands not unlike yours. A cup of tea given to thee, a cup of welcoming grace, received gratefully. Have you ever noticed that it's always the moment of recognition that changes everything? The 2 travelers recognized Jesus because he was in their home and at their table. Radical hospitality, inviting someone in to belong, making it home. It disrupts the cycles resulting from inhuman actions, like children separated from their parents at the border, or not knowing where your next meal is coming from. It disrupts cycles of brokenness and hatred. It's a form of resistance, too, that creates a sense of belonging and makes others feel valued and cared for. Perhaps we are this disruption that someone else needs. Jesus went home with them. It was when he was in the home with them and sitting at their table that recognition occurred. He broke the bread, and they knew who he was. Henry Nouwen writes, "The 2 disciples whom Jesus joined on the road to Emmaus recognized him in the breaking of the bread." What's more common? What's more ordinary than breaking bread? It may be the most human of all human gestures, a gesture of hospitality, friendship, care, and the desire to be together. It signifies community and unity and peace. When Jesus does this, he does the most ordinary as well as the most extraordinary thing. It is the most human as well as the most divine. The great mystery is that this daily and most human gesture is the way we recognize the presence of Christ among us. God becomes most present when we are most human. It is the place where God invites vulnerable people to come together, where fear vanishes and God becomes very close. The recognition and disappearance of Jesus are one and the same event because the disciples recognize that their Lord Jesus now lives in them, that they have become Christ bearers. At the beginning of their journey on that road, the two disciples had been stunned and were grieving. But when they made room for a stranger at the table, when he broke the bread and shared the bread, it was then, at that very moment of recognition, that they saw Jesus. As a community of faith, we've begun a journey too. Not on the exact same road as the two travelers we read about this morning, but not all that together different. Our road is expanding the circle of our church even wider than it already is through the Mixed Use Project. We're taking risk. We're opening our home to others who are searching for one. We're practicing the spiritual work of hospitality, a way of living that will cause you and me to instinctively move over to make room at the table for everybody seeking a relationship with Jesus. In this spiritual practice, it's right then. Very often we will experience life-changing moments of recognition. We will experience what we've been searching for all along, ourselves, to be a place, to be known, to be loved, to be a home for others. It is then that we may turn around and see Jesus among us.